You think the worst thing about working on a video game is that sometimes you run into a little problem. But really, it's more like you're working on problems and sometimes you run into a little video game. And the worst problems by far are you. Yeah, you cutie, look at you. How do we get you to play this game? Stay playing this game. Recommend this game to other people and make content for this game in order to keep it relevant and funded for all time. The puzzle is people. People are the puzzle video game executives are trying to solve for that I presented in the last video. I debated, rebutted, and convincingly convinced myself that many of them are shooting for hero shooters or some kind of live service role-based player versus player experiences. Those have, by design, some of the widest appeal to potentially market themselves and sustain themselves so they can print money into the heat death of the universe. If you can attract enough players to get it running, that's one big fat if, and I've got the math to show for it. It's a given that games designed to be multiplayer need, by definition, multiple players. You can't play chess alone. I mean, you could, but it'd be awfully sad like that one fella in the Pixar short. But let's just say, for argument's sake, that you're not in the mood to play with yourself, in which case chess needs at least 2 people to play. A 5 versus 5 hero shooter needs at least 10 people to play. Or does it? If one of those 10 players leaves, then you have to replace them quickly, otherwise the others are going to get frustrated because they can't play and then they'll abandon your game. Then you need to find 10 more people. But you're not going to have one person sitting around waiting for someone to leave to fill a queue. That just doesn't happen. What if you have 10 players, but one of them's in America and the other's in Australia where their pingery-doo is too high to maintain a stable connection? So they leave. What if you have 10 players, the connection's fine, but the skill levels are drastically different, and the poor little noob gets tired of being stomped or the veteran player gets bored of playing with their prey? What if nobody wants to play support? Game development. Like I said, you make problems and sometimes a game pops up. Cheers. You're gonna need a bigger boat, and way more than 10 players to hit what's known as critical mass. That's the lowest number of players needed for a multiplayer game to sustain itself and not fall to pieces as soon as one person needs a potty break. All those features, being live service, multiplayer versus player, and role-based characters, are now working against you, raising the critical mass, and if a game can't get over it, then it may be dead on arrival. And we can kind of set up a little formula to get a rough estimate about whether or not a game has enough daily active players to sustain itself based on its own design parameters. You simply need to plug in base players needed, player availability, connectivity, required roles, skill. There's more factors, but we'll leave it there for now. First, the base. A 5v5 game needs at least 10 people playing to create a match. Deja vu. But if a match lasts for 20 minutes, then you can't create a new match until 10 different players are ready to go. So you multiply the base by the time and you get 200. Okay, we went from 10 to now 200 players needed daily, so that this whole thing doesn't fall apart as soon as we turn it on. But remember, boss, you were the one insisting that it be role-based. I'll use MOBAs as an example of a genre that needs to fill 5 distinct roles: support, carry, mid, jungle, solo. You now have to multiply that 200 by the 5 roles and you end up with at least 1,000 players needed. You might think that's not a problem, Mr. CEO, but that's per server. What devs do to avoid connectivity issues is put players that are close together in a common server. We'll say this game has at least 3 it needs to keep at critical mass: the Americas, Europe, Asia. So 3 times 1,000 is 3,000. And because you wanted a competitive game, Mr. CEO, we do need to take skill into account, otherwise people are going to leave out of boredom, shame, or frustration. We'll use really bare-bones matchmaking that'll group players into 3 tiers: not so good, average, really good. 3 times 3,000 is 9,000 players. Boy, that sure is a lot more than the original 10 players we started with. Is it over, you ask? Depends. How many game modes do you want? Let's say 2. Ranked for the sweaties and unranked for the sexies with nothing to prove. We're now at a critical mass of 18,000 daily players, and I'm being generous. This model here assumes the barest of minimums. Multiplayer games tend to have more than 2 modes, more than 3 servers worldwide, more tiers for matchmaking, and humans that haven't evolved past the need for sleep. Let's lock in for a second, get closer to a realistic number. You got 10 players at base times 20 minutes of playtime. Assuming the average player plays for 4 hours a day, then you gotta cycle in a whole new set of players 6 times in a 24-hour period. 5 roles still, at least 5 servers across North America, South America, Europe, Asia, and OCE. We can keep it at 2 game modes, ranked and unranked. You want more separation among your skilled players if you have any intention of maintaining a competitive scene, which you do. 5 is a little better. And now we have 10 times 20 times 6 times 5 times 5 times 2 times 5 for 300,000 daily players minimum for the matchmaking system to actually work as intended. And if you haven't played one of these games, trust me, matchmaking is one of the most incessant, ever-present complaints from the live service PvP crowd. 3 things are certain in life, my friend: death, taxes, and people yelling at developers to fix the matchmaking. Sometimes, though, as you can see, it's a player count problem. And this model's still on the generous side because it assumes a person's playing every day of the month. I didn't talk about crossplay, haven't even begun to account for what the crest number of players needs to be in order to maintain this trough during the downtimes. All this stuff is what pushes the critical mass number into the millions. Out of all the video games, this attempt to maximize appeal creates a massive player count requirement that ends up biting MOBAs and hero shooters in the ass. If you'd like to see the math applied in a different direction or get a second opinion, I'll include an article I've been holding on to for a few years now called Why Good Matchmaking Requires Enormous Player Counts, written by the developer of Awesomenauts, where they talk about how their average player count of 1,000 isn't all that much, and they need something closer to about 5 million monthly players for their MOBA to work as intended. And the other burning question then is, why would anyone want to spend millions of dollars on a game and years of development just for it to flop in the end because you can't get enough players for it to work? Well, that's a much smaller math problem, because if you do get, say, 1 million monthly players and the average purchase is $2, then you make $2 million a month, 24 million annually. That's the gamble when it comes to MOBAs and hero shooters. Most of them do die, but if they can hit critical mass, it's like creating a new element. And more importantly, the person that called the shots gets to be called Tony Stark. Now let's look at Concord's player count. 697 players was the all-time peak just on Steam. 25,000 units were sold in totality. If I may be pedantic and a little graphic, Concord wasn't a live service game that died. It was stillborn. What a great closing line that would have been, but I don't want to risk leaving this as an anti-live service advert and such a sour mood. I like live service overall. I think the pros outweigh the cons, and it's only getting better. But the insistence that this is the only way to make video games is a con, and whoever's pushing it should end up as a con, in a prison, legally banned from climbing the corporate ladder any higher than a gas station manager. And I also know indie developers and AA studios like to make multiplayer games as well. All I ask is that you check your parameters. Maybe you don't need so many roles or as strict of roles. Deadlock, while a MOBA is lowering their critical mass burden by choosing to design flexible characters. Maybe make your game 3v3 instead of 5v5 to have a base of 6 instead of 10. Maybe PvE instead of PvP like Helldivers 2. Consider some bots. Look at Fortnite. Even though a match needs 100 players to start, I'm pretty sure most of those are bots. There's many ways to play around with it. Game development's always a gamble, but at least try to stack the odds in your favor.